everyone. Thank you for joining this ISG Smart Talk. We have quite the lineup of software advisory webinars this year. Last week, we took a look at how the Oracle landscape has changed. And today we'll be discussing the top strategies to source and contract with Microsoft in 2021. Before we kick things off, I'll quickly review a few items with you. We are recording this webinar, and you can access the replay using the same link used to register for the live event. And please feel free to submit a question at any time during the presentation by using the Ask a Question box on the left side of your window. With that, I will hand things off to Bill Huber to kick off today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Jillian. So welcome all and thank you for joining us today. Today's discussion is, of course, top strategies to source and contract with Microsoft in 2021. Our presenter today is Louis Pellegrino, who is our Global Director and lead of our Microsoft practice. Louis is a world-renowned Microsoft expert. He's spent over 20 years within the Microsoft organization in the licensing desk and other roles. And we've had the good fortune of having him with us at ISG since 2014. So just a quick reminder, do submit your questions. We'd love to keep this very much interactive. Next week, join us again for a webinar on software asset management strategies. And with that, I'd like to just quickly review the agenda with you. So today we'll talk about 5 key points. First is the overall industry trends for software and how that sets the frame for Microsoft. Secondly, we'll lead into the Microsoft world and then get into the specifics of how Microsoft structures its deals, what type of required planning and research you need to do prior to negotiating with Microsoft so that you're ready to get the maximum result for your firm. And then lastly, the bottom line, how do you get results? So Louis, over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and good day, everybody. My name is Louis Pellegrino, and I do have the pleasure of being your host for this morning's discussion. And as Bill went through the agenda, we will begin our discussion with, again, just a recap of what is happening across the software industry at large. And what I want to do is, you've made the investment in time this morning to join us, and so I want to kind of at least underpin what some of the benefits should be and what you should walk away from this discussion being at least better informed about. There's no question that for all enterprises of any scale, the cost of doing business with Microsoft has become increasingly expensive. In many cases, they are now your single biggest software provider, bar none. They are in a business model where they have uniquely now positioned themselves across 3 separate clouds, both a traditional productivity cloud, which is Microsoft 365, a hyperscaler cloud, which is their Azure, and more of a CRM ERP cloud, which is their Dynamics 365. They are using their online business and its breadth to really kind of drive a number of other business agendas. And this is all accomplished through the combination of how products and services come together in their bundles. And they are actually very creative in making sure that they can retain their traditional markets and expand into new markets through these bundling options. They are pushing people very aggressively to move away from traditional software and into the subscription-based models, largely because, of course, it creates a stickiness, which is very difficult for customers to pull away from in the near term. And if you've already done that, if you've already migrated to Microsoft 365, for instance, and you're coming up on a renewal of your earlier online agreement, you're probably noticing that some of that promotional pricing that they might have extended 3 years past is now being rescinded, and it's very difficult to even retain discounts. Add to this recent announcement that Microsoft has made with respect to its traditional on-prem software business, where people would acquire a perpetual license and make the decision as to whether or not to cover that with maintenance. That's actually going away as well. Microsoft has already announced that future versions of Exchange and SharePoint and Skype, for instance, will only be available as subscription models, which really kind of undermines the whole software assurance value proposition. And again, Microsoft is looking at their channel, their distribution, their sales channel in a unique way as a means to sort of pass off more and more of the customer-facing responsibility away from Microsoft and many of the markets that they service to their partners. And so these are all things that probably should be in the back of your mind, understanding, what's really driving Microsoft and how do I use those insights to help me negotiate my best outcome with them. What has happened across the board is simply this. The business of buy-sell software has really changed dramatically. We're moving much more into a subscription-based model. Sometimes it's the same software. Like in the case of, I just mentioned, Microsoft no longer offering perpetual versions of their products, but only subscription. But largely, it's become the applications have been put into a large data center, either owned by the company or used by that company to deliver it. And so, other than companies who were probably born in the cloud, and we can name a few here: Google, Dropbox, Salesforce, Okta, Coupa, and others. These companies actually, built their products with a cloud sort of focus from day one. Many of the other traditional players, whether it was Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, and the like, have adapted their traditional software to cloud variations. And sometimes they are same product, sometimes they are different flavors of the product. But in the course of doing that, the general business model for software and software maintenance has dramatically changed. In some cases, there are more technical options that are available to you because of the way these products have been engineered, but ultimately there are less business options, and that's one of the things that we want to focus on right now. And particularly when you think about in the traditional software business, where, as I mentioned earlier, when there was software and a decision to put maintenance on that software, yes or no, customers could do some very deep analytics and make decisions, sometimes very difficult decisions, and choose not to put maintenance on their software and instead budget for a refresh at some point in the future. But that was an option that was available to them, and maybe it made economic sense. But that option does no longer exist. So people now really don't have a go dark strategy or go dark option anymore. So this, again, is one of the byproducts of the industry moving away from traditional buy-sell to hosted solutions. If you look across that spectrum, when we talk about your bias, and if you come from the world where you were buying or licensing perpetual software and now you're in this subscription model, most of these businesses that are, now for the non-cloud providers, they now have software moving away from annual price points and annual maintenance, and they've been sort of recrafted to have monthly subscription price points. These subscriptions, depending on which particular provider you're working with, can take on the form of either straight a la carte discrete services or bundle services. And where the bundle services are kind of front and center, this is really a function of where customers can look at what is supposedly the feature set of those services and decide how much or how little of a feature pack they want. And of course, what Microsoft and other companies do is they use this bundling option as a way to retain their markets that they already have a dominant position in, but also begin seeding other markets where they are now really kind of moving into for the first time. And where other cases where there have been, as I mentioned, if you're renewing an online agreement from 3 years earlier, if you're just simply wanting to retain the service levels that you had, there's really no opportunity or there's no business need to add new workloads to your mix today. You're seeing that this is it's becoming a much more expensive proposition over the long term. And in the case of Microsoft, obviously, where we are focusing our conversation today, because they are very active in 3 cloud properties, both a productivity cloud with Microsoft 365, as I mentioned, the hyperscaler with Azure, and their CRM, ERP offerings through Dynamics, they are not necessarily willing to retain the discounts in that productivity arena unless you are willing to make additional investments in the other 2 clouds. And so bottom line here is that subscription models are forever. There's no opportunity to stop paying Microsoft. So we really need to think long term about what is our strategy to do business with Microsoft and how do we manage this new model where we really do have an obligation to them month over month, year over year. So I'm going to pause for a second and kind of put into perspective the company itself. Who are you dealing with when you're working with Microsoft and your local account team? You're dealing with a rather significant organization. As I mentioned, Microsoft really has fashioned itself around 3 primary cloud properties. Their productivity cloud, which goes under the banner of Microsoft 365, their hyperscaler, which goes under the banner of Azure, and their CRM ERP cloud, which is under the banner of Dynamics 365. Microsoft would love to have you enrolled in all 3 clouds. In our experience, what we see more often than not is Microsoft has done a pretty good job of getting presence and enrollment in at least 2 of the 3 clouds. There are some where Microsoft actually has clients in all 3 clouds, but they are in the minority. And so customers typically are either going to be in Azure in a combination with Microsoft 365, or they'll be in the Dynamics 365 cloud as an alternative because maybe they're using other hyperscalers like Amazon or Google. And what happens now is these clouds do have some tension and leverage. There is some interplay between them. And if you want to retain some of the concessions that were formerly granted to you in the Microsoft 365 cloud, you're finding that Microsoft is making kind of if-then propositions. The quid pro quo here is if you want value to be retained in your Microsoft 365 spend, it's going to cost you the enrollment or the participation in the other two clouds. And so, Microsoft mission, if you want to go back and look at what Satya and others are saying, is, they want to empower every person in the organization to achieve more. But, the corollary of that, of course, is to spend more as well. The business itself, the cloud representation is more of a figurative depiction of how Microsoft's businesses are actually organized. But if you look at the organization itself, how is it constructed? There is three primary businesses that Microsoft reports on. It reports on its intelligent cloud component, which is the combination of Azure, its dev studios, and its server products. Its business and productivity services, which takes on the form of their Microsoft 365 cloud, the traditional Office, the acquisitions of LinkedIn, as well as their Dynamics products. And the less known for most enterprise customers is what they call the more personal computing. Most of us do have Windows Client in our organizations today, but this particular business extends beyond the Windows Client. It includes their Surface technologies, Hologram, and others, as well as their gaming and search tools from both Xbox and Bing, respectively. So it's a pretty big business. It's organized in ways that Microsoft has retained this model now for at least 4 years. Every 5 or 6 years, Microsoft undergoes a significant organizational restructuring. We're moving towards the tail end of this model that's been in place, again, about 4+ years. So I wouldn't be surprised over the next year or two if we see Microsoft shake things up and reorganize their business again somewhat differently to accommodate its new directions in the markets. This model that they're in today really is a byproduct of something that happened nearly 10 years ago, exactly a little more than 10 years ago. I thought this was an interesting graphic because it really shows you the behemoth that Microsoft has become. Its transformation, the business that was traditionally the software and the Office productivity suites and the servers for your data center, Microsoft made its announcement in 2010 that it was really going to begin shifting its business over to a hosted business model. And it really has been now 10+ years since that announcement is made, and they pretty much completed that journey. So this transformation, it was a 10-year design transition from traditional perpetual license and software maintenance to a largely hosted software services business. And you can see the growth that this organization has experienced, with last year's business peaking over $140 billion in total sales. It's an enormous business. And when you look at these year-over-year changes, this is the law of big numbers. A 5 or 10 or 15% move, on $100+ billion business is a significant growth. And so, Microsoft obviously is if not the largest software provider in the world, certainly pretty close to it. And if you look at it more from a kind of a annual reporting perspective, looking at year over year, in 2020, they grew a giant business 14%. The stock price increased better than 50%. Earnings per share 14%. Net income across the board. There is not one pivot or not one sort of point of measure where Microsoft's business wasn't really kind of fully functioning and hitting and banging out on all 8 cylinders, no matter what business it was. The only business that has single digits is kind of the Windows OEM business. And that's largely because a lot of people, when people buy PCs, that OEM number goes up. When people are not buying PCs, that OEM number stays, relatively flat. But even here, in this particular view, Microsoft had a super strong year. And I find this interesting. So the point I want to make on this particular slide is simply this. We've come through an extraordinary year in 2020. 2020 obviously introduced the world to a phenomena, a COVID pandemic, and many businesses have struggled and suffered through this. But the interesting thing is that the effects of COVID were not sort of evenly distributed across all businesses worldwide. In fact, if you kind of focus on Microsoft for a second, for the first 9 months of calendar 2020, which actually would cover, it would cross over 2 fiscal years. Microsoft's fiscal year actually ends at the end of June, and they begin a new fiscal year beginning July 1. But if you take the last 6 months of their fiscal year and the first 3 months of their current fiscal year, so accounting for a total of 9 months, Microsoft has generated $36 billion of net income in the first 9 months of a pandemic year. During probably the hardest hit quarter, that quarter from July through the end of September, they increased their business by $4 billion and 3.2 with come through revenue and income respectively. So if you want to just put that in perspective, in the first 9 months of this very challenging year for most of the world, Microsoft earned more than 95 of the 100 Fortune 100 companies during the entire pandemic-free 2019. So a reason I put this out there is because I think it's very important in our discussions with Microsoft, as they have really thrived during this pandemic and many of its customers have not. We still see some behavior on Microsoft's part, which is a little bit questionable, where Microsoft is asking customers to spend more in order to retain some of the concessions that they might have had in years past. But why? I mean, Microsoft is actually doing very well this year, and it seems like they would be, willing to work with businesses who have been less fortunate to make sure that, they're able to continue running the business, using the Microsoft products they depend on, but not being squeezed to make additional investments in, services that they may not yet be ready to deploy while they're just trying to stabilize the rest of their business. So this kind of brings us to the overall, what I call the nuances of doing business with Microsoft. All right. So as I mentioned, Microsoft over the past 10 years has undergone a full-scale, redefinition of the business, moving from finished goods to services. Every Microsoft customer that they directly have teams assigned to, they're all being sort of worked into account plans. Those account plans have very specific revenue metrics and growth metrics. So all of you who have account teams today calling on you, you should know that Microsoft has got double-digit growth built into their account plan for you to be able to perform to. How do they do that? They do that through a combination of upselling and overselling in some cases, even compliance. When I worked for Microsoft years ago, the thought of raising audit in a conversation with a customer was simply taboo. They did not want to ever give customers a sense that Microsoft was being opportunistic and trying to extract additional revenue out of customers through compliance. There were, of course, compliance incidents, but they were handled and they were sort of discreetly managed. They weren't really mainstream factors in the accounts team's overall revenue performance plan. As they are really trying to now completely exit what was the software assurance business of past, there is some tension in doing business with Microsoft where you want to retain software assurance. And if that software assurance spend is limiting you from being able to consume the same workload in their cloud, Microsoft is trying to make it less attractive to continue with maintenance a la software assurance, and for you to repurpose those same monies to run that same workload in their cloud instead. They repackage and they either add features or they deprecate features or they move features around from subscription bundle to subscription bundle. All of this as sort of an indirect way to generate a price increase. They don't normally take a fixed SKU and say this SKU is going to be X% more this year. They try to really kind of avoid something as obvious as that. But instead, they will just, again, change the packaging so that you don't have a like-for-like representation. The new package of the moment is priced differently than its predecessor, but it's a different combination of products and services, so they avoid the appearance of having a straight price increase. Traditional software, as I said, is really being sunset. Right now, we know for sure that the productivity servers that will come out into the market this year will only be available on a subscription basis. It's probably not that much longer into the future where we should see Windows Server and SQL Server maybe follow a similar path. Microsoft, in terms of its product support, has moved away. Now they've been in this unified support model for a number of years, although they've had to sort of work with some of the larger premier customers to migrate them in baby steps from where they were to the unified support model, which is a fundamentally different business proposition for organizations. No longer can they negotiate product support as an independent silo, but product support is effectively a tax on their current product and subscription spend. And now when you do business with Microsoft, discounting is always important. There's no one who minimizes or trivializes the value of making sure that we have unit cost optimization. But you have to look beyond that, because it's not just current price, but it's future price. And how can I hedge and protect myself from material changes that come down the path at my next renewal? Remember, this is not a buy-sell relationship anymore. This is a landlord-tenant relationship. And you are going to be paying Microsoft some sum of money every month for every year for many years to come. And so you don't want to be short-sighted and focus your negotiation strictly around unit cost optimization. And why? How do we know that's true? Well, because we know it's true because customers who are coming to a natural renewal of their current online services agreement, if they don't want to extend new services or increase the workloads and simply want to retain the services that are currently expiring, in many cases, that promotional pricing they got, 3 years earlier is either being reduced or rescinded outright, unless customers agree to do something beyond just simply retain their legacy services. We get asked repeatedly, is my deal good? Here's my offer. I mean, what's the benchmark that I should be measuring my quote or my offer against with respect to the rest of the industry? All I can tell you is simply this. Having worked on Microsoft's business desk for many years at Microsoft, which was the negotiation arm that Microsoft extended to its enterprise customers, it's a Rubik's Cube. There is the only thing that is standard in Microsoft's pricing is its price waterfall, which has been around since the 1990s. This is simply their level A, small customer, level D, large customer, and B and C in between. I will tell you also that price waterfall is very archaic. When it was conceived at a point in time when the largest customer that Microsoft was calling on in their mind, it was 15,000 devices. Microsoft routinely calls on customers today who are in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of users, but yet that price waterfall has not been adapted to the new reality. But when we look at how does Microsoft price, what are the variables and attributes that they sift through before extending a user a final offer price? Look at the list, your size, the scope of the product, what's the mix, how much of your balance is really kind of retained on-prem versus new online, what's the volume of growth from the previous term, are you using any of their hardware technology or conferencing technology, how many clouds are you enrolled in, what industry are you in, what markets in the world, because different geographic markets have different sort of sensitivities to pricing. Are you willing to do any co-marketing or PR? And what's been your historical discounting? So when you sort through this, it's very difficult ever to have an apple compared to another apple when it comes to benchmarking. And so when we go through these exercises with customers, this is how we work with our clients to figure out how to optimize unit cost pricing across all the variables that Microsoft introduces into its discounting calculus. I throw up a couple of these slides. They're very busy slides, and I won't spend a lot of time trying to unpack them. But it is important to see what Microsoft does in its packaging approach, how it blends so many different services into these bundles, how these bundles effectively are kind of a Russian doll box where, a Microsoft 365 F3 is obviously a bundle unto itself, but all the services are inherited into a Microsoft 365 E3, which extends, of course, the number of services and benefits extended. And of course, that becomes inherited into a Microsoft E5. And then even within some of these feature sets, Microsoft, everything in this view, all these boxes are individual services that can be licensed a la carte. Of course, Microsoft's pricing logic makes it difficult to reconstruct a bundle by using a la carte components, because by the time you sum those a la carte components up, you've exceeded what Microsoft's pricing is for the bundle. But they've got, they recognize that they've they didn't apply good leverage to some of the compliance and security, and they were having in years past to really dramatically discount their Microsoft 365 E5 because customers wanted either the security features or the compliance features, but not the whole thing. And so Microsoft sort of quickly recreated sub-SKUs or sub-bundles within a bundle in order to either protect price points or to offer a different way to discount. So it's complex, and it's complex by design. So, when we work with clients, we look at this thing and we really try to spend quality time understanding and assessing and vetting how much of this feature landscape really has application for your end users and where it's a stretch. And Microsoft is pushing for you to basically make an investment in a service that maybe you have a competing product already in place, or maybe it's just not a priority for you. So, we have to make sure that we understand that in concert with the slide that we just cleared in order to figure out, how do we go about the process of first building the right bill of materials, and then once that's constructed, how do we get to unit cost optimization? One of the areas that we spend some time with is, and you should as well, is, as we mentioned, Microsoft is certainly dominant in its productivity stack. There are very few commercial alternatives to Microsoft Office, and we can probably talk a little bit about that separately. But in the other areas where Microsoft has grown and has created these bundles, it's in the areas of security and management. And so what we're always looking at, what you should be looking for as well, is where in the Microsoft value proposition is there service overlap with products that you may already have acquired from other providers. And we've kind of used this large template, but you can see in sort of the upper half here, we've highlighted those things that are security related, that Microsoft, has now offerings in the market to deal with those capabilities. But these capabilities have been serviced for many, many years by other non-Microsoft providers. And so the exercise here is to sort of go through a conversation with our client and inventory, whether or not they are addressing the capability first. If they are addressing the capability, what is the tool or the service, the product that they're addressing it? If it's not the Microsoft variant, side by side, would they prefer to stay with what they're currently using? Maybe they've extended it. Maybe there's some customizations to it. Maybe it's just a more feature complete offering than what Microsoft has. Because Microsoft has a product in a particular capability area doesn't imply that it's best of breed. It just means it has a product in that area. And many times when customers will actually do the side-by-side analysis, they will discover that, independent of Microsoft having a product available to address this capability, it's not as feature complete as maybe a non-Microsoft alternative is. But, these are some of the important steps and taking in order to sort of rationalize what bundle makes sense and at what price. So to this point, we've kind of just taken a step back and we've looked at, Microsoft, generally speaking. We've looked at the change in the company, what's happened over the past 10 years, how big the business is, how successful they are, how, in the year 2020, when the pandemic was really kind of hurting many of our customers, Microsoft, and not only Microsoft, but, several other, industries did thrive. Certainly Microsoft thrived. And it thrived, again, in the law of big numbers. $100+ billion company growing 15% is another company unto itself. So what we want to do for the next section here is sort of just cover off how we orchestrate and work with our customers to acknowledge the fact that we're in a different relationship with Microsoft. It's not buy, sell. I just don't buy a license from them, make the decision whether to put or not put maintenance on it and run that license. You have to think long term. And your approach to Microsoft really needs to be grounded in what we call kind of the 4 pillars of a deal framework. These 4 pillars are proactively used on the parts of our clients. This is about changing the direction of communication. This is about not simply receiving offers to renew from Microsoft based on whatever their priorities are, but this is offers to buy coming from your perspective based on a lot of pre-work that you do, and to make sure that when you present that to Microsoft, you have a context, a wrapper around that, which we are really calling our success factors, which kind of boil down to 4 pillars: a price to value, which basically means this particular product or service supports my business and I associate a certain value to that. Time to value, as Microsoft brings new products and technologies and services to the market, value realization doesn't occur instantly. There's going to be some latency in between when I make a decision to look at something or run something until when it delivers value realization at scale. Flexibility. Now that we're in this sort of long-term relationship, it can't be hard-coded and very difficult for me to have Microsoft accommodate and work with me during change of circumstance. And 4, predictability. This winds up being my most important one because it's the one I see Microsoft probably inflict the most concern onto its customers with. Every 3 years when a deal comes up for renewal, most of my customers kind of hold their breath. They don't know how Microsoft is going to show up or what to expect. And that's not sustainable in a relationship that has to extend, many, many years moving forward into the future. So this is about changing the dynamics from, the provider's offer to sell and moving it to your offer to buy. Value then has to be, you're going to have to ask Microsoft to be a little bit more precise in associating what it's offering to you and how it aligns with the value and the pillars that we've just sort of began to talk about. I've talked about this just briefly, but let me just throw this back up into view. So there's a definition for each of these things. And this time, the price to value is, again, the perceived or the estimated value of whatever the product or services is, not what this provider says he wants to charge you or what its historical prices are. I mean, I'll use Office as an example. Office has been around since the mid-'80s, right? It has obviously gotten more features and it does a few things that are a little bit more sexy than it was 20 years ago. But at its core, you still create text documents, you still create worksheets, you still create presentations. And independent of how many features that Microsoft may have added over the years, there's not much of the change in user behavior that really leverages a lot of that feature. So the value of that product to the business probably is fundamentally no different today than it was 10 years ago. So why should the product cost more? As Microsoft moves into these new markets where it has security and management products, and they're asking you to take a bet on them and to use their variant for a particular capability in lieu of some other non-Microsoft incumbent, again, how long before I see value realization? It's that window, and what's the fair price for me to pay while I'm going through that onboarding of a new technology. Flexibility, I mean, the past year is just a perfect poster child for why flexibility is important. Flexibility as it relates to being embedded in your agreement, an agreement that anticipates change as opposed to has to sort of stop, drop, and roll and make, people have to open up the agreement, re-engineer, rewrite, amend it because there's a change of circumstance. A well-written agreement has provisions and has some assumptions that you can rely on in the event that you have a change of circumstance that you need to work with Microsoft about. And this goes back to the point I was making earlier that discounting, while important, should not be sort of, the only thing that gets the attention in your discussions with Microsoft. You need to have some greater flexibility since now you are a tenant to your new landlord. And last, and probably to me most important, is this concept of predictability. It should not be one of those moments of truth every 3 years when you sit back and you just wait for Microsoft to tell you, well, that Office 365 E3 thing that you were paying X for these past 3 years, well, now it's 1.3x or 1.4x, or you can't renew it because I changed the product SKU. That product SKU is not even available anymore. And you instead have to move your focus over to this SKU, which has some extra stuff. And by the way, it costs more. So those are things that we really want to spend much more time planning, anticipating, and holding Microsoft accountable to when they present their offers to us. How does your offer align with these 4 pillars? Equally important is the fact that how we get to the point where we can package an offer to buy is because we've done the research. We've done the work that is the drill down, very, very comprehensive assessment of what our needs are in these particular service towers. When I look at the service towers across the organizations that we support, they may have different labels, but effectively, they all kind of fall into these concepts of end user computing, network services, InfoSec or IT security, application services or DevOps, whatever you want to call it, and then increasingly cloud application services, which are slightly different than traditional IT application services. So working with our clients, we drill down into each of these silos, looking for exactly, if you're an existing Microsoft user, what has been the utilization of these products, who's been using it, how often, are you really kind of licensed for the right combination of SKUs? If you have pipelines that will potentially introduce new needs or new workloads into the organization, what's the latency? How long before they actually can become deployed at scale and value realization can be achieved? Because in many cases, these are not unaddressed capabilities in security and management. You may have Ping for directory or Okta for directory or Varonis for data catalog and your Proofpoint for spam and malware. There's a lot of good products in the market that deal with these services. Microsoft, of course, has got their new variant. And then maybe in some instances, Microsoft's value proposition of better together is in fact better together, but that's not always the case. And we really want to spend the right amount of time preparing for and assessing whether or not it's better to stay with a combination of Microsoft and non-Microsoft, or maybe the economies and the value proposition that Microsoft can make available to us in their total, complete, inclusive stack, makes it worth our while to look at it. But under no circumstances should you be in a situation where you're left with Microsoft telling you what you need, because our experience is that they are good at dispatching some of their specialists into the many work centers that your business sort of depends on, and engineering or ginning up what I often call artificial demand. What I mean by artificial demand, that it's the shiny new penny. The folks who are in those work centers, like the thought of being able to use this stuff. This stuff then in turn gets sort of circulated and sent up to your IT sourcing folks. The IT sourcing folks, may not have the wherewithal to challenge what they're hearing from their clients, and so they just go down the path of presuming that what this is a genuine demand. But when we get involved and we start peeling that onion back and looking at it a little bit more critically, what we find is that in 50% of the cases, what is coming to the attention of the IT sourcing folks from their various work centers in these towers could be construed as artificial demand. So gearing up. So if we know we've got a renewal, and we really start the clock at T-minus 12 months. Microsoft's typical unamended term is 3 years. So as you get through the second, as you get there into the third and final year of your agreement, it's not too early to begin thinking about the negotiation. You may not have to put a full court press on until you're 6 months from the renewal, but you can never be too early. You can always be too late, but you can never be too early. You need to put together teams who will do the core negotiation for you. You need to do all of the pre-negotiation activities that are shown here. You need to ultimately take the findings from those two first work streams, package it in a communication to Microsoft, bring them along to the place where you are, explain to them, what your flexibility is, what your flexibility isn't, what you're leaking from them, refer to the 4 pillars that we just talked about in the last 2 slides, and to manage the process. This is probably, one of Microsoft. I don't know if it's a shortcoming or it's an asset, because they tend to be slow to respond, allow large gaps of time to lapse between, when you ask for something and when you get for something. But the net result is it eats up the clock and you get down to the wire. You're not only dealing with Microsoft, you have many other providers, whose attention you need to, extend. And so you can't be time sunk with Microsoft. And so many people feel like they get to the end of the wire, they got to get this deal done. There are other equally pressing commitments they have to address. So they wind up maybe doing a deal which is sub-optimized because they let the process get away from them. You have to harness the process, manage it, and hold Microsoft accountable in order to ensure that you get an optimized transaction. When we say it's never too early to start, here's kind of our high-level set of activities and work streams that we execute. Here are the the sweet spot durations. Many times we don't have the luxury of having as much time as we like, and we do what we can within the window of time given to us. The concession we normally wind up having to sort of deal with is the iterations. Microsoft is a company that if you just iterate and iterate and iterate, you continue to nip away and chip away at some of the things that you want to see included in the deal that weren't offered up at front. But you get to a place where normally after about a half dozen iterations, we feel pretty comfortable that we've optimized the deal as much as we're going to be able to get it optimized. When you shorten the amount of time you have to work with, you unfortunately reduce the number of iterations that you have available to work with. And so, we get to done. Will we say that we got to the best outcome? Sometimes we do. Sometimes we get to the best outcome because it's pretty clear that we have enough evidence and enough support to compel Microsoft to work with us in good faith to deliver the outcome we're looking for. But in other ones, you just need to grind that thing just a couple more turns in order to get what you want. But you can see here between this is approaching 6 months worth of total elapsed time. So here's the bottom line. If you don't take this seriously and you don't anticipate the requirements and the preparation and the overhead and the necessity of a plan, if without a plan, what can you expect? Well, if you don't lead, then you most certainly will be led. All right. If Microsoft does not see you presenting an offer to buy, they're certainly going to introduce an offer to sell. And that offer to sell is rarely, if ever, aligned with your genuine needs. It's 100% aligned with Microsoft's business objectives for that current fiscal year. Guaranteed, if in between the time of your last negotiation and the current negotiation, if Microsoft has either acquired new products or built new products, they're going to find their way into your offer, whether you ask for it or not. And so you're going to wind up spending time asking Microsoft to basically extract that stuff so you can focus on the things that you really need to run your business on. And as I mentioned, the Microsoft account teams they're first of all, for the customers that they will choose to retain direct account relationships with. And I mentioned in the earlier slide that there is a division of labor beginning to sort of unfold in Microsoft where, they want a large chunk of the customer base really to be addressed and accommodated by their partner ecosystem. But there will always be customers for whom they will have a direct relationship. And because of that, because they are investing in sales overhead, they're going to be expecting your organization to spend more money with them. And they go into your work centers, they sell everything they can, the shiny new penny. You hear it from your, whether it's end user computing or InfoSec, you hear that you need this, that, or the other. Yeah, your ability or inability to challenge that, oftentimes puts you in an unleveraged position because you're negotiating for something that is sort of artificial demand. And we want to do everything we can to avoid you from having to sort of fall into that circumstance. So this is the last slide, and then I'm going to hand it back over to my host. And the bottom line is this. I religiously work with every one of my clients around those 4 pillars. They're not bumper stickers. They are actually the underpinning of how to formalize your business agenda with Microsoft. You really do need to take this discussion super seriously, dedicate the right amount of planning time and preparation to get this, and to begin to sort of look at your own history and find evidence where your spend has not aligned with price to value, has not aligned with time to value, has been inflexible, and you've been a victim of unpredictability. You need to bring those up front and center and make sure they're shared with Microsoft. As I mentioned, predictability to me is probably the top of the 4 because of the long-term nature by which we're going to have to do business with Microsoft. Just because you renew a retained service, there should be no exposure to an arbitrary price increase. I mean, without giving you some other value for that increase in spend that they're asking for, what's the justification for asking, I want you to pay more for the worksheet that you produce, or I want you to pay more for the Word document to produce, when in return there's no more value to the business than what there's always ever been for that business. As I said, turn the tables. Do not respond. Do not be in a position where you're responding to an offer to sell, but instead be proactive and tender an offer to buy. As I mentioned, 6 months is the right amount of time for most organizations. of 5,000 or more. If you don't have the 6 months of planning, doesn't mean you can't get a decent deal. It just means that you may leave that out. You may not have gotten the best outcome because you just shortened the amount of cycle time that you had to iterate with Microsoft. And last and foremost, again, don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to do this well. And don't overestimate your know-how in how Microsoft builds its products and brings its products to market, because they change routinely every 6 to 12 months. Unless you're an analyst watching this stuff day in and day out, there's a pretty good chance that something has happened that you're not going to know about until the very first time when it's brought up to you during the renewal discussion. So with that, I'm at the end of my content, and I am going to turn it back over to my hosts, Jillian and Bill.
Thanks, Louis. We do have several questions. The first one is actually directed to you. Are you seeing any lower unified support costs as the model rolls out to more customers?
We've seen prices that were quoted that don't completely align with the arbitrary percentages. They basically have 3 categories of spend. They have servers, apps, and Azure. And they have 3 different percentages that apply to your subtotal spend in each of those categories. If they do that math, and if the result of that math has got a number wildly different from your traditional Premier support spend, there's obviously some ground to negotiate with Microsoft and to bring that transition number into closer alignment with a reasonable growth on your historical Premier spend. If you are already a unified support customer and you're at a point where you're renewing unified support, no different from some of the problems we talked about with subscriptions, where promotional pricing was used in one term and now you're at a renewal term and they're trying to basically rescind that promotional discounting. The same event could happen with unified support. So when you do unified support and you are the beneficiary of better promotional pricing, you've got to be able to look for what's the implications, what's the predictability that I'm going to have to deal with at renewal. So the answer is yes, but you just have to plan for it.
All right, thanks for that. And Bill, I think this next question is for you. Is it safe to assume more or less that there are similar strategies by other companies like Salesforce and similar recommendations for preparation?
Absolutely. And I invite whoever asked and all of you to join us. We have a series of webinars throughout the year. We will be covering Salesforce, VMware, Oracle Part 2, SAP, Adobe, Cisco, ServiceNow, Palo Alto, SAP, but I didn't already say that, IBM, and software asset management, among others. So we have a full agenda throughout the year. In most cases, the webinars are being scheduled about 3 or 4 months prior to the supplier's fiscal year end, which may be with some possibility close to when your next renewal cycle is. But in the interim, just if you have any questions specific to any of them ahead of the webinar, reach out and we'd love to talk with you. And also, as we do each of these webinars, they remain available on demand online. So you can go to our website, find some of the previously done webinars, and listen in on those as well. So I hope that's helpful, but please do reach out with any specific questions. Thank you.
All right, next question. Is it really worth moving our Exchange customers to 365? 1,500 mailboxes costs a lot, and their investment on Exchange almost zero.
There's definitely a crossover point. I mean, you own your license on Exchange, right? So other than the hardware maintenance, the refresh spend to make sure that server is current, and whether you're running either a current or a near current version of Exchange, at the lower end, it doesn't always appear to be a slam dunk win. In fact, we have customers where it's not necessarily just that they're small customers, but they have a set of profiles throughout the company to which there are very heavyweight users and very lightweight users. And in some cases, our recommendations is that there be a retained portion of Exchange on-prem, because the value proposition for those lightweight users moving to the cloud just isn't there unless Microsoft does something egregious with its discounting, which they certainly can. But the risk you have with that is that they have the ability to rescind that when it comes to a renewal time. So I would say that every customer's value proposition varies, but it certainly becomes a little bit more tenuous when you are what I call a level A customer. Microsoft's, if you remember that taxonomy, A through D, Microsoft has a level A landscape, which is up to 2,500 users. And there, sometimes the economics and what it costs you to run that workload in your data center can't easily be recouped based on subscription spend.
All right, thanks, Louis. Next up, is there any particular product area, i.e. Azure, where Microsoft is incentivizing their account/sales teams going into 2021?
It will be largely for some of the acquisitions that they may have made to supplement their marketplace. Their products like Databricks and Data Universe and things that Microsoft has, made an investment in order to extend its Azure Marketplace. And for customers willing to help Microsoft generate returns on those investments for those services, typically we see them, working in good faith to try to figure out some ways to reduce the friction that's, in front of you to get some of these products, provisioned and made available. If it's just pure play compute, if all you want is VMs because you're lifting and shifting, the price points for reserved instances across the market in general, whether it's Amazon or Microsoft, most of these providers have, they know it's a commodity, and so they've got to price it as such. And to negotiate discounts on things like that with that unit cost is difficult unless you're really spending large sums of money with them on an annual basis. And large sums of money now are sort of tacking at least $5 million a year in order to see any additional concessions around infrastructure pricing. Platform pricing, again, because of the acquisitions that Microsoft is making and their need to sort of drive adoption, you'll probably have a little bit more flexibility.
All right. Next up, could you comment on SQL/Win Server licenses portability on Azure and GCP based on licenses rules published by Microsoft in October 19? Second part of the question, with a hybrid SCE, what is the risk to go on GCP?
So there's two concepts here. One's called hybrid, and that's specific to Microsoft's Windows Server and to their Azure service. Hybrid has no other place. It doesn't apply to Amazon or Google or anything to that nature. So that's point one. Point two is license mobility, and that is Microsoft's gesture to you to take a license, which is covered by software assurance, and to be able to move it from different hosts. And SQL Server has license mobility, and therefore you can, move it to a host in Azure, in Amazon, or Google. Your requirements to Microsoft are to continue the SA spend. There is some question as to whether or not they're comfortable with those licenses being put into a multi-tenant, or if they want dedicated tenant. I have to continue to reread some of the positioning that they've made. But for instance, with Windows Server, license transfer is the last option. And that's been in place for many, many years, which says Microsoft says you can move a license assigned to a host to another host, but you can't move it back in less than 90 days. So, it was Microsoft's way of making sure people just didn't kind of move around the license, to be opportunistic. Windows licenses that were acquired prior to their change, I believe it was October of last year, can still, be used in a hyperscaler, but only on a dedicated infrastructure. They can't be using those licenses in their general multi-tenant environment. So it's a long question. I'm sure there's more to it than what you probably are trying to seek, and maybe it'd be a good opportunity for you to contact us, and we can follow up more directly with respect to your circumstance.
Good call. Thanks, Louis. Next question, is Microsoft offering any new agreement templates to be aware of or to watch out for, i.e. MBA/MBSA, EA, MCA, SCE, etc.?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they do have a big modernization effort still underway. The modernization effort has been underway since 2010. I mean, it is the Microsoft Customer Agreement, sometimes called the MCA, is currently a work in process that is intended to streamline and simplify the requisite documentation necessary to run Microsoft products. It is being featured largely in the Microsoft channel. So it goes back to a point I was making. Microsoft is trying to really, to sort of knock down some of the headwinds that today exist inside the relationships that Microsoft end users and Microsoft partners have to deal with, so that Microsoft could transfer more of that responsibility over to their partner ecosystem. So the MCA is the one I'm aware of. It is supposedly going to unify a lot of the component agreements that exist today. Microsoft's 3-tier architecture, an MBA, a program, and an enrollment. They're looking for ways to sort of collapse that. Yes.
All right, a couple more questions for you. What kind of discount should I expect if I move from an E3 service to its E5 upgrade?
Let's go back to the Rubik's Cube on that one, because everyone's got their own circumstances and the variables that figure into how Microsoft's pricing calculus works. There is, generally speaking, discounting available to customers who are upgrading from an E3 workload to an E5 workload. Is it a 5% discount, a 10% discount, a 20% discount? It varies. And don't believe anyone who tells you anything to the contrary. There is no blanket 20% discount because someone moves from E3 to E5. If that were the case, I would not be nearly as busy as I am, because it's just not the way it works. All those circumstances, which we identify, and we try to figure out, how do I leverage the things that Microsoft values in its pricing calculus and extend that in my offer to buy to Microsoft, so that they understand that it's in their best interest to hit these price points, because I've addressed some of the things that were in that Rubik's Cube stack.
All right, and next up, why is PowerApps so expensive?
That's a great question. Because it can. Now, and Microsoft is sort of realizing that they may have created a little bit of a problem for themselves. They've been very aggressive with promotions on PowerApps. I mean, PowerApps, in round numbers, is a $40 per month per user subscription. And it doesn't do anything per se. It's not an interface. It's not a fully developed application. It's a tool. And so it does do automation. It's a great tool for automation. I'm not an engineer or designer, so I can't tell you the ins and outs of it. But right now, they're selling their $40 subscription for $12 and their $12 subscription for $4. So they realize that there's a lot of price sensitivity to that. I wouldn't be surprised if long-term they have to adjust those prices downward. But in the moment, I think it's grossly overpriced.
All right, looks like we have time for one more question today, and that is Google Workspace mature enough to replace Office 365?
Well, I get asked that quite a bit. All right, so let me step back for a second and answer that question as a technician. First of all, Google Workspace is an architectural change. Google Workspace is all about a browser interface. And why not? Everybody who's really building tools today and user software is doing so with the presumption that the browser is the UI, okay? And what it does is it opens up a lot of possibilities. If you're really doing most of your consumption of applications through a browser, you don't need a full PC or a fat client anymore. You could actually do things with Chromebooks and other smaller form factors, not quite the heavyweight PC. But it is architectural change. I will tell you probably that one Office application that struggles to really become web efficient is Excel. I mean, you could do Word documents, you could do presentations, with a browser-based version of Word and PowerPoint all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. Excel still requires a lot of resource that is local. And so I think Microsoft keeps Office around so that it doesn't have to do something with Excel. But if you were looking at a Google Workspace option, first recognize that that's a browser-based implementation. And Microsoft has its own browser-based implementation. We would have, if really you're looking at that kind of architectural change, we would say, listen, the learning curve to transition from fat client to thin client is probably less of a learning curve if you do it within the Microsoft domain. But if you're angry at Microsoft and you just want to kick them out the door and you want to move over to a Google Workspace, the first real order of business is to understand the architectural implications.
All right. Thank you, Louis and Bill, and thanks everyone for joining today. This does conclude our time. As mentioned, the recording of this webinar will be available at the same link you used to register for the live event. And if you have any questions or would just like to get in touch, you can find us at www.isg-one.com. And at the close of today's webinar, you'll also be redirected to our software advisory landing page so you can view future webinars. Thanks, everyone.